Welcome to Varn Blog Solo, and today I want to talk about the guru principle. What is the guru principle? It is the idea that people will repeat something with someone they identify with as an extension of themselves to their own disadvantage and against their own rationality. But it isn't just with individual people like we think of with cultists or charismatic political leaders or uncharismatic political leaders that say unique and novel things. It's also in general. We could see this in the kinds of things ideologies expect you to believe. Now, it's obvious right now with conservatives that what you'll see is people parroting Governor Trudeau because Trump said that. And I'm saying this in March of 2025, since I do have people who might be hearing this in the future, are having to believe increasingly absurd things about this or that to maintain allegiance, to talk about constitutionality when it's obviously been thrown out of the water, or efficiency when people are having to waste time hiring people back and treating the entire federal apparatus like a bad tech firm. But it's also in the way people demand exceptions of others. So they'll demand rationality of people who are different from them. The Christian will point out the irrationality of certain kinds of political statements required for wokeness, and that's in quotation marks. The DI defending liberal will ignore the fact that while universities all use this language, that universities are increasingly less and less and less economically diverse, and also take in fewer and fewer people who are economically disadvantaged amongst people of color. So marginalization is actually only discussed about people who have less resources than the most, but more resources than most. The fact that these are contextualized words that are repeated without context and made to stick behind the vibes, that's another problem. I mean, ask somebody not just what wokeness is, whether they're for it or against it, but what social justice is, and you'll get 1,000 different answers, even in the academic literature, which often doesn't bother to define the terms or talk about where their paradigms come from, because frankly, often they don't really want you to know, or they want to pretend that it's novel, even though it's borrowed from another field. I've read stuff about, social justice and technical writing, which was borrowing paradigms from the humanities from 20 years ago as if they were new. They're not. Same thing in pedagogy all the time. Also, the guru principle applies when people start asking you to believe in things that are things you priorly critiqued. So you'll see people who critique identity politics start talking about privilege of people who are from different social economic stratas, not even classes, stratas than them. Whether or not one is white collar or blue collar, or talking about lumpinization or not. Never mind that the person talking may have dealt with addiction, seen addiction, and seen people die from addiction. Doesn't matter. And that's why you care about lumpinization, because it comes with socially negative consequences that you have to deal with. And you just don't want any of that to be critiqued, even though many of the people screaming that we shouldn't critique it are people who are basically fail sons with a glass floor. No. So much of our society hides its values and what it makes excuses for, and what it asks you to believe that is irrational or cannot be proven. And not everything can be proven. This even the new atheist ran into a problem about rationality, is that total logic doesn't even make sense. You have to have norms to even talk about how to distinguish norms from descriptions. After all, the definitions of some qualia are effectively arbitrary, and so are preferences. Renaming things so that they sound more respectful often actually does so for the speaker. I've critiqued this too. I've talked about homelessness versus houselessness. Now, I've been homeless. I don't feel comfortable with people saying, oh, you're not homeless or houseless. You still have the implication, you still have a home in the community that you live in. Yeah, with at the time, people who were thrown on the streets dying of, at that time, AIDS, believe it or not. It was late 90s. Um, People coming in and out of jail, people who were kicked out of mental health care, etc., etc., etc. Now, it doesn't matter in some ways because when you focus on someone's positionality and you're not trying to have them understand something about themselves and you're not saying what they want, what you want them to understand about themselves, you're basically doing a naked act of aggression because you're personalizing something about it, about who's making the argument instead of engaging with the argument, often without even stating what bothers you. Now, that liberals have done this and leftists have done this for several decades doesn't mean that it's still not um, an invalid tactic, even if the positionality statements are true. And almost as a guru principle thing itself, people say systemic when they mean prevalent, people say structural when they mean common. People talk about the structural but focus on the individual. People talk about social privilege and cultural capital while focusing on the individual. Those are not individual problems. No amount of checking your privilege undoes the world that created the privilege in the first place. So yes, there's guru principles everywhere, and there's obvious ones. You know, having to state and bend yourself to whatever a leader says. We clearly see this right now. But there was also times about this in the past. We saw the jingoism after 9/11, if you're old enough to remember that 20 years ago. Semantic codes serve a purpose, some of which is jargon, which both protects and makes more precise speech, right? But some of which is just to assert naked conformity. It's a way to lay out your states of exceptions and the irrationalities you expect people to believe as a proof of loyalty. The irrationality isn't an accident, nor is it planned. All right. It's not that people are planning this out all the time. Sometimes they are, but mostly they're not. It's more showing who's willing to go along with the social group and who is not, and who's really going along with the guru or leader and who is not. Can you think for yourself? Well, no one completely thinks for themselves. But if you abnegate every sense of personal responsibility and personal development, you are not that useful to the group. You're a cog, and you're a subordinate and subsumed cog. Don't be that. Make your argument, state what actually bothers you, think through what is said, and don't believe something just because someone says it or just because it's what your group's supposed to believe. Is it rational? I mean, I'm going to do a whole video on this, but isn't it suspicious that the most um, activist scholar model places that are the most insistent on combining scholarship and activism are the most elite universities in the country, who are also places of prime drivers of inequality, both in credentialing, but also in what their hospitals do and take advantage of, and what their endowments do as landlords and take advantage of. And there's no structural way to fix that without completely changing the nature of universities. The universities aren't hotbeds of Marxism. There's probably less Marxist in universities today than there was in the fucking Cold War. I think Austin Taylor Harper pointed that out recently on Time to Say Goodbye podcast. No, the issue is there's a noblesse oblige to justify and hide what is going on. But it often doesn't help that many people, except people critiquing and curtailing what can be said in their own profession. And which elites get access to it. And that's all dependent on representation and subsumption. And that too becomes a part of the guru principle. Are you willing to deny what is blatantly obvious? What you make excuses for and what you rationalize says more about your values than what you LARP. Now, I've said we should have compassion for people LARPing because they don't have a lot of power. And instead of saying, what should I think? What should I believe? How should I feel? You should be asking people, what should I do? What do you ask of me? What are the action steps? That's both politically, interpersonally, socially, not how should I feel on the inside. The function of a thing is what it actually does, not what it tells itself it does, not what it was designed to do but doesn't do. There's a lot of anger right now at academia, and it gets expressed in fucked up and anti-intellectual ways. Absolutely, completely, 100%. No argument from me. And I was reading about how they were tearing down and vandalizing research reports at a conference in healthcare in Florida because the word diversity was used, and it wasn't even referring to diversity of people, it was referring to different types of neurons firing. Are people canceling functions on things because they use trans, not referring to transgender, but to things that happen in frogs? Response and counter response, both idiotic, both given to the guru principle, both given to social manipulation. One of the gambits I've had in most of my life is betting that in aggregate people are smarter than they make as individuals. And I still more or less believe that. But I have to admit, the last 10 years are really putting that to the test. I also said that things that you are made to feel highly emotive about and that threaten your identity, you won't listen to groupthink about, and the groupthink will be irrational. The dangers of nationalism really cluster around this. But what people make excuses for shows you a lot about what they actually believe. Period. End of discussion. If you claim not to be a Democrat, but you always make excuses for them, you won't look at how they lost, you won't, then you're a Democrat. If you claim not to be a Republican and you're always making excuses for them, even if you have some weird esoteric way in which you're not, then you effectively are that. Everyone's dominated by negative partisanship now anyway. That's the primary operating emotion when things start to fray. When no one believes a positive world is possible, and the only change that seems possible is just a chainsaw buzzing through the upper middle elite so the even richer can benefit from that. As an individual, you should not play that game. And collectivities and aggregates would be a lot smarter as if individuals you didn't. Social subjects require personal responsibility. You can't do it alone. You can't overcome everything alone, but you do have to be accountable. And your accountability to what you can change is ultimately alone. You want to be a good comrade, be a good person. Now, people will say I'm judgmental and shrill, and that's all true. We all have vices. All right. But I won't tell you who or how, but trying to help people through alcoholism and fellow comrades through that. Trying to help people lose weight because they wanted to, not because I believe that they have to. I've struggled with that. I've been 20, 30 pounds lighter than I am right now and 100 pounds heavier. Sitting with someone when they lost a child. It's one of the hardest things you have to fucking do, and I've done it. Many of you have too. The small things that you do that are banal and unsexy, they matter, but they're not political in the same way. But I don't trust you as a political subject if you can't do them. And people who subsume themselves to gurus often can't. And it makes sense why people do it. I'm not even judging people. Offloading parts of your cognitive load is so tempting. It's even a good heuristic. You trust people, you follow the heuristic of trust. I used to tell people to do that here. But ultimately, you still have to be responsible for what you believe as an individual. You still have to be responsible for what you do as an individual. And you need to demand people who want to put political asks of you or ask you to believe things, what they want you to do, not what they want you to believe. This weird quasi-Christian notion of orthodoxy mattering more than orthopraxy, a belief mattering more than praxis, of statements of faith mattering more than principles enacted, of abstract ideologies mattering more than programmatic documents with things clearly that we should do and how to do them and what the consequences are when you don't. Those build communities. And no matter what politics you have, you're going to need those more than you're going to need consistency of ideology or like-minded niches, because right now this is really breaking a lot of people's brains. I don't mean to sound like Jonathan Haidt, but it really is a problem. You can't interact with people who disagree with you. Well, if you knew what everyone really thought, you'd learn how much they didn't agree with you. Sometimes, frankly, I have to tell allies that they are ideological enemies so that I can treat them better, because I don't have the same demands of people who I respect personally but don't have an ideological or a political project with than someone that I do. Can you go through the world only hanging out with people like you? Then you're probably not a very useful person, and you're probably not going to recruit very many people to your politics because you don't know how to recruit anyway. And there's lots of pressures. This is another guru principle I'm seeing right now in academia, to no longer code switch, because it's wrong to ask people to change the way they talk. They should just demand people accept them as they are. Why? Why? Nor should you accept other people just because they exist. You should tolerate them. You should give them minimum human decency, but accept them as part of your political project just because that's absurd. So these guru principles and this focus on semantic truth and orthodoxic belief and abstract notions which you can project upon, start asking people what they want you to do. You may ask me what you want me to do. I don't always know. Right now, I'm actually kind of at a loss. It's hard to ask people without power to fight an oligarchy on their own. And just calling it an oligarchy is often kind of funny because a lot of people calling it an oligarchy are also oligarchs. It's just like a lot of people complaining about the elites are also the elites within the elite categories themselves, and they're taking advantage of it and really trying to manipulate people to form a counter elite, of which they see you as an inert force that can be used for that. Not a good way to go. Not good at all. So protect your peace, my friends, and don't buy into this shit. Think for yourself. Listen to people, all kinds of people, even people I ideologically detest. I do try to listen to them and I do try to hear them out. Although when people can't tell when I'm using hyperbole and when I'm being making an actual argument has always been frustrating to me, because I clearly use rhetoric, but I don't clearly expect people to take my rhetorical statements as an argument. That's why I don't really do debates, because a lot of debates are about rhetoric, not logic. They're poor simulacra of logic. And not that there's one kind of logic anyway, and you can be perfectly logical and have invalid premises. So it doesn't matter. Anyhow, don't focus on the semantic. Don't just believe something to fit in. And remember that your personal responsibility and what people ask of you to do is more important than what they ask you to believe. What you do says more about who you really are. And I might be preaching to the choir here of a few hundred people, but that's what I do. That's what I want you guys to go out in the world and do. Okay? Is to start asking what to do. Start figuring out if what people ask of you is acceptable. Because when people don't tell you what their asks are, but want you to believe things, they kind of probably want an ask that they know they can't ask of you. At least not directly, at least until you're not already bought in. Protect your peace and protect your mind. Because to be a good comrade and a good member of the community, you have to be a good individual too. And you have a moral duty to be as intelligent as you can be. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, do all the normal shit. Bye-bye.